I still remember the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey filling my parents' house that evening, the way it always did every Christmas, warm and heavy, almost trying too hard to convince us that this was a season of comfort. Outside, the neighborhood in the suburbs of Columbus was quiet, lawns trimmed even in winter, porch lights glowing softly as if nothing ugly could ever happen behind those doors. Inside, everything felt staged. The dining table was set perfectly. The good plates were out. Mom had lit the candles she only used twice a year. Dad sat at the head of the table, shoulders squared, posture rigid, like he was presiding over something more serious than a family dinner. I had driven over alone, parked my car at the curb, and sat inside for a full minute before getting out. Just breathing, already bracing myself. I was 33 years old that Christmas, and somehow I still felt like a child walking into an exam I had not studied for. My townhouse was only 20 minutes away, the first home I had ever owned, the one I bought with my own savings after years of working and budgeting and saying no to things other people took for granted. Dad knew that. Mom knew that. Claire knew that too. My younger sister was already seated when I arrived, her hair curled, her sweater carefully chosen, smiling politely at everyone. She looked nervous, the way she always did around Dad, like she was waiting to hear whether she had passed or failed without knowing the test questions either. We hugged. It was quick, awkward, familiar. The early part of the evening passed the way it always did. Small talk that skimmed the surface. Questions about work. Comments about the weather. Mom refilling glasses before anyone asked. David cleared his throat every few minutes as if he had something important to say, but was waiting for the right moment. I could feel it building. The same way you feel pressure change before a storm. Every clink of silverware felt louder than it should have. Every laugh sounded forced. Dinner itself was fine, if fine means quiet and careful. Dad talked about the neighborhood, about a house down the street that had sold recently. He always did that, keeping mental tabs on other people's lives, other people's assets. Claire nodded at the right moments. I mostly listened. I had learned years ago that listening was safer, less visible, less likely to draw fire. It happened right after dessert. The pie plates were still on the table, half-eaten slices of apple and pecan, crumbs scattered across the cloth. An aunt leaned forward, smiling, and said she had heard I bought my place young. She said it was impressive, especially these days, and asked how I managed it. It was meant kindly. I know that now. But the room shifted the moment the words left her mouth. I saw Dad stiffen. I felt it before he even spoke. He set his fork down slowly. He looked at me, not with pride, not with curiosity, but with something sharp and calculating. He started talking about order, about how families work best when people know their place. He said not everyone gets to go first, that some people have to wait their turn. The word turn landed heavy in my chest. I had heard variations of it my entire life, just never said quite so openly. Mom glanced at him but said nothing. Claire stared down at her plate. Then Dad stood up. I wish I could tell you that I misunderstood him, that I misheard. That stress or emotion twisted the moment in my memory. But I did not. He pointed directly at me, across the table, in front of everyone, and said that I had stolen my sister's future. He said it plainly, without hesitation, as if it were a fact everyone in the room had already agreed on. He said I had gone ahead when I should have waited, that by buying my house first, I had ruined Claire's chances, that I had broken something important in this family. The room went silent, not the peaceful kind, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat in your ears. I felt heat rush up my neck and into my face. My hands went numb. I remember thinking, this cannot be happening. Not like this, not here. No one said a word. No one defended me. Someone shifted in their chair. A spoon clinked against a plate. That was it. I did not cry. Not then. I sat there, staring at Dad, trying to understand how the same man who had taught me to balance a checkbook and show up on time could look at me like I was a threat. In that moment, it became painfully clear that my success was not something to be celebrated. It was something to be managed, controlled, punished. As you're listening to this, I can't help but wonder where you are right now. For me, This happened at my childhood dining table, staring at the same wood grain I'd known forever, realizing it no longer felt safe. If any of this resonates with you, I hope you'll stay with me and share your thoughts as we go. I pushed my chair back slowly. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. There was nothing to say that would have mattered. I could feel something closing inside me, like a door finally locking after being left open for too long. I told Mom I was leaving. She reached out as if to touch my arm, then stopped herself. David did not look away. Claire still had not lifted her head. The cold air outside hit my face like a slap. I walked to my car on autopilot, my boots crunching softly on the driveway. I sat behind the wheel and stared straight ahead, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The house glowed behind me, warm and intact, as if nothing had shattered inside it. I did not look back when I pulled away. The drive home felt longer than it should have. Every red light felt personal. Every familiar street sign reminded me that I had grown up here, built my life here, and still somehow did not belong. When I reached my townhouse, I sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. This place was mine. Every wall, every floorboard, every quiet corner existed because I had worked for it. I unlocked the door, stepped into the silence, and let it wrap around me. It was the first time that night I felt like I could breathe. I replayed Dad's words over and over, trying to make them make sense. Stolen. Future. As if opportunity were a pie with only one slice. As if my years of saving and sacrifice had somehow taken something away from Claire instead of building something for myself. As if love and support were finite resources that had to be rationed strategically. What hurt most was not the accusation itself, it was the realization beneath it. David had never seen my independence as strength. He had seen it as permission. Permission to give me less. Permission to expect more. Permission to treat my achievements as optional, expendable, and now, apparently, harmful. That night, I did not sleep much. I lay in bed, thinking about all the times I had been told I was fine on my own, all the times I had believed it meant something good, strong, capable, reliable. I understood then that to Dad, it had meant something else entirely. By morning, my phone was quiet. No apology, no explanation, no follow-up. Just silence. It felt heavy, but it also felt honest. For the first time, I stopped trying to translate it into something kinder. I did not know yet that this dinner was only the beginning. I did not know that within a week, that pointed finger would turn into something much colder and more official. But as I stood in my kitchen, coffee cooling in my mug, sunlight coming through my own windows, I had a strange, unsettling thought. If Dad was willing to accuse me like that in front of everyone, there was no limit to how far he might go to protect the version of the future he had already decided belonged to someone else. And that was the moment I realized this was no longer just about family. It was about control. And I was done pretending I did not see it. Once that thought settled in, it began to pull memories loose. Not all at once, but slowly, the way old photographs slide out of a drawer you forgot existed. As I stood there in my kitchen that night, the quiet pressing in from all sides, I found myself thinking about how long this story had really been building, long before Christmas dinners and pointed fingers, long before townhouses and adult arguments. It had started when we were just kids, back when the stakes were smaller, but the patterns were already set. Claire had always been an athlete. Even in elementary school, teachers talked about her coordination, her focus, the way she moved across a field with confidence that seemed almost instinctive. Dad noticed it early. He noticed everything about it. He sat in the bleachers at every game, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, eyes locked on her like he was watching something precious take shape right in front of him. When other parents clapped politely, Dad analyzed. He talked about potential, about ceilings, about how far she could go if she had the right support. I remember the way his voice changed when he talked about her. It was sharper, more energized, like he was already picturing a future version of our family that revolved around her success. He did not just see a kid playing sports. He saw momentum, possibility, proof that all his sacrifices would eventually turn into something tangible. By middle school, sports were no longer just an activity. They became a plan. Claire played soccer in the fall and volleyball the rest of the year. Weekends were no longer free. They were booked months in advance with tournaments in neighboring towns and sometimes in other states. David drove hours without complaint, coffee cooling in the cup holder, radio turned low, his attention fixed on the road ahead and the future he believed was waiting for her. I remember sitting in the back seat with my homework spread across my lap, trying to read by the light of passing street lamps. The car always smelled like fast food and gym bags. I would ask questions about my assignments, about projects or tests coming up, and Dad would nod absently, telling me I would figure it out. He always said I was good at figuring things out. It sounded like praise at the time. I did not understand yet that it was also a dismissal. Money started flowing in one direction. Private coaching when Claire's skills plateaued. Specialized camps during the summer that promised exposure to the right people. New gear whenever it was recommended, even if the old equipment was barely worn. Dad called it an investment. He used that word often, usually late at night at the kitchen table, surrounded by bills and envelopes. He said you had to put resources where they would produce results. He said spreading things too thin never led to success. Sometimes I sat on the stairs, listening, not fully understanding, but sensing that these conversations were not really meant for me. They were about futures and returns and smart choices. They were not about feelings. When I needed something, the answer was always the same. We are focusing on your sister right now. You are fine. You are independent. You do not need as much. I learned quickly which requests were worth making and which ones were not. New shoes could wait. Field trips were optional. Extras were unnecessary. I told myself it was temporary, that once Claire made it, things would even out, that this was just how families worked. I did not resent Claire then. If anything, I admired her discipline. I saw how hard she worked, how much pressure she carried, even as a teenager. I thought we were both just playing our roles. Hers was visible, mine was quiet. In high school, the pressure around Claire intensified. Scouts came to games. Coaches shook Dad's hand. People talked about scholarships in lowered, serious voices. Dad glowed when they did. He introduced Claire to strangers with pride, listing her stats, her work ethic, her dedication. He spoke about her future like it was already written, like the ink had just not dried yet. I stood beside them, smiling politely, listening to my sister be described like a promising startup everyone wanted a piece of. No one asked what I was interested in. No one asked where I wanted to go. I told myself it did not matter, that I was not the one under pressure. Dad started talking openly about college being covered. He said athletic scholarships were the goal. He said this was how smart families did it. I believed him, or at least I wanted to. I assumed that when the time came, there would be a plan for me too. Maybe not as glamorous, but something. After all, I worked hard. My grades were solid. I stayed out of trouble. Surely that counted for something. It did not. When it came time to look at colleges, everything revolved around Claire's recruiting schedule. Campus visits were timed around tournaments. Conversations about finances centered on how to stretch things just a little further to keep her competitive. When I asked about my own options, Dad told me scholarships were everywhere if you looked hard enough. He said I was smart and capable and would land on my feet. He said it with confidence, as if that absolved him of any responsibility to help. Then the scholarship offers did not come. Not the big ones. Not the ones Dad had been counting on. Claire received interest, encouragement, vague promises, but nothing that secured the future Dad had been so sure of. I watched him refuse to accept it. He blamed the system, the coaches, the timing. He said she was a late bloomer. He said the right opportunity was still coming. Instead of pulling back, he doubled down. More training, more travel, more money. Dad talked about patience and perseverance, about how investments sometimes took longer to pay off. He said quitting now would be foolish. Mom nodded along, anxious but compliant. Claire looked exhausted, carrying expectations she had never asked for, trapped between wanting to please Dad and wanting to breathe. I started working around that time, part-time at first, then more hours whenever I could get them. I stocked shelves, ran registers, picked up shifts no one else wanted. I bought my own clothes, paid for my own school supplies. I did not complain. I thought this was what being the responsible one meant. Every paycheck felt like proof that I was doing the right thing, that I was earning my place. But the truth was harder to admit. The more self-sufficient I became, the easier it was for Dad to justify giving me less. My independence was not admired. It was used. It became the reason I was overlooked, the excuse for why resources flowed past me and settled elsewhere. There was a night I remember clearly. David was sitting at the table with a stack of papers. Talk out loud about budgets and priorities. He said you had to know where to put your money if you wanted a return. He said families were no different from businesses in that way. I stood in the doorway, listening, and something shifted inside me. I realized he was not talking about us as children. He was talking about assets. In that framework, Claire was the high-risk, high-reward option. I was the steady one. Reliable. Low maintenance. Not exciting. Not worth betting on. It took years for that understanding to fully settle. But once it did, I could not unsee it. Every decision, every conversation, every subtle slight lined up with that logic. Dad had not chosen Claire because he loved her more. He had chosen her because he believed she would pay off. And I had been set aside because I already belonged to myself. Standing in my kitchen that night after Christmas, that realization felt heavier than any accusation. I had not stolen anything from my sister. I had simply refused to stay small enough to protect an investment that was never meant to include me. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the memories come and go. There was sadness there, yes, but also clarity. For the first time, I understood the rules I had been playing by without ever agreeing to them. And once you understand the rules, you can finally decide whether you are willing to keep playing. For me, that decision had been made long before I ever knew I was making it. I started working when I was 16, not because anyone told me I had to, but because relying on myself felt safer than waiting for support that might never come. Independence was not rebellion. It was insurance. My first job was at a small grocery store not far from our house, the kind of place where the aisles were narrow and the same customers came in every week. I worked evenings after school and long shifts on weekends, bagging groceries, wiping down counters, restocking shelves, learning how to smile even when my feet burned and my head throbbed. With unfinished homework, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of cleaning solution clung to my clothes long after I clocked out. The pay was modest, barely enough to feel significant, but it was mine. That mattered more than I could explain back then. I learned quickly how different it felt to earn something yourself, how handing over cash you had worked for made every purchase feel heavier. I stopped asking for things almost without noticing, not because I was told no, but because I no longer wanted to hear the reminder that resources were going elsewhere. I would come home late, shoulders aching, peel off my uniform, toss it into the laundry, and sit at the kitchen table with my books spread out in front of me. Dad was often there too, surrounded by paperwork, scribbling notes, making calls about Claire's training schedule or the next tournament. His voice carried a sharp focus when he spoke about her. Times, locations, costs, next steps. He barely looked up when I walked in. Sometimes he asked how work was going, more out of habit than interest. I always said it was fine. Fine was easier than explaining how tired I was, or how heavy everything felt, even at 16. Fine meant I did not have to take up space. Every paycheck went straight into a savings account I opened myself. I paid for my own clothes, my school supplies, my senior pictures. I learned how to stretch $1 until it felt thin. I learned how to say no to invitations because I needed the hours. While my friends talked about weekend plans, I checked my schedule. While they worried about prom dresses, I worried about gas money. I told myself this was what responsibility looked like. I wore it like a badge, even when it cut into me. At the same time, the spending around Claire only increased. New equipment appeared regularly. Shoes were replaced before they were worn out. Special camps during the summer that promised exposure to the right coaches. Long drives to competitions that swallowed entire weekends. Dad treated each expense like a necessary step towards something inevitable. He talked about momentum, about not losing ground. When Mom hesitated and mentioned the cost, Dad brushed it off. He said you could not hesitate when you were building something important. He said backing out too early was how people failed. I watched it all from the sidelines. I was proud of Claire in my own quiet way. I saw how hard she worked, how exhausted she was, how much pressure lived behind her eyes, even when she smiled. She carried expectations she had never asked for. But I also saw the imbalance. Every time I reached a milestone, it passed without comment. Good grades were expected. Long hours at work were normal. My independence became background noise. It was no longer something anyone noticed. It was simply assumed. By the time we reached high school, the divide felt permanent. College application season arrived like a storm, but only for one of us. Dad talked endlessly about Claire's options. Which programs fit her sport best? Which coaches might still be interested? He made calls, sent emails, held meetings at the kitchen table that stretched late into the night. Papers were spread everywhere, calendars marked, plans adjusted. The future felt crowded with her name. When I asked about my own plans, Dad barely paused. He said I would be fine. He said scholarships existed for students like me. He said I was capable and did not need hand-holding. He said it with confidence, as if believing it made it true. That was the moment I realized confidence could also be a way of stepping away. I applied to schools on my own, filled out forms late at night after work, wrote essays while the house slept. I did not ask for help with applications or fees. I thought that was part of proving myself. When acceptance letters came, I opened them alone in my room, sitting on the edge of my bed, quietly folding them back into their envelopes. There was no celebration, no discussion about logistics. I learned to keep my excitement contained, small enough not to inconvenience anyone. Then came the news Dad had been dreading. Claire did not receive the scholarship he had counted on. There were offers, interest, encouragement, but nothing that secured the future he had already built in his mind. I remember that night clearly. Dad sat at the table, staring at a letter, his jaw tight. Mom tried to soften the moment, saying things would work out. Claire sat stiffly, eyes down, already bracing for disappointment. David refused to accept it. He blamed the system, the coaches, the timing. He said she was being overlooked. He said this changed nothing. Instead of pulling back, he pushed harder. More training, more travel, more money. He talked about late bloomers and long games. He said quitting now would be irresponsible. I watched Claire nod, trying to look strong, even as the weight of his expectations pressed down on her shoulders. That was when something clicked for me. Failure was not an option for her. Not because she would be punished, but because Dad had too much invested. Her success was tied to his sense of purpose, his belief that all of this sacrifice would pay off. My path, by contrast, required no such justification. I was already managing, already supporting myself, already proving I did not need much. I graduated high school with solid grades and a quiet sense of accomplishment. David shook my hand. Mom hugged me. There was no party, no speech about how proud they were. That energy was reserved for Claire's next season, her next chance. I started college while working more hours, juggling classes and shifts, learning how to function on very little sleep. I paid my tuition in installments, bought used textbooks, packed lunches to save money. I watched other students move through campus with parental safety nets I did not have, and I told myself not to envy them. People sometimes told me they admired my drive. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I felt strangely hollow. Admiration did not come with relief. It did not make things easier. It only reinforced the idea that I was expected to keep going without support. Every time I came home, the pattern was the same. Conversations centered on Claire, on her progress, on what came next. David asked about my classes occasionally, but there was no curiosity, no follow-up. I was doing what I was supposed to do. In his mind, that meant I no longer required attention. The unfairness did not hit me all at once. It settled slowly, like dust on furniture. You stop noticing until it coats everything. I told myself this was temporary. Once things stabilized, once Claire found her footing, there would be space for me too. But the space never came. When Claire eventually accepted a college offer without the scholarship Dad wanted, he framed it as a strategic pause. He said this was just another step. He said opportunities would come later. He said they just had to keep supporting her. I listened from the doorway, feeling something harden inside me. I realized then that there would always be a reason, always another investment, always another excuse. I finished my degree while working nearly full-time. I attended my graduation with a sense of relief rather than celebration. Dad did not come. He said he had a scheduling conflict. Mom took pictures. Claire texted congratulations between practices. That was it. The price of my independence was not just exhaustion or missed experiences. It was the slow understanding that no amount of effort would ever earn me the same consideration. I was not failing. I was succeeding in a way that did not fit Dad's model. The night I fully understood that, I sat alone in my small apartment, surrounded by thrift store furniture and mismatched dishes, and felt two things at once: pride in what I had built with my own hands, and sadness for the recognition that would never come from the one person I had unconsciously hoped for it from. But even then, I did not stop. I kept working, keep saving, keep moving forward, because if I was going to be on my own anyway, I might as well build something that belonged entirely to me. That thought stayed with me as the years moved forward. It did not shout. It did not demand attention. It settled into the background of my life like a steady pulse, something I could feel even when I was not consciously thinking about it. I worked full-time after graduation, then picked up extra shifts whenever I could. I lived below my means without calling it sacrifice. Small apartment, second-hand furniture. Meals planned around what was on sale that week. I did not talk about long-term goals with anyone, not even myself out loud, but every decision I made quietly bent in the same direction. I wanted a place of my own, something solid, something no one could take from me, no matter how disappointed they were or how badly they wanted me to rearrange my life for someone else. Buying a house was not a sudden idea. It grew slowly, patiently, the way my independence always had. Late at night, after long days at work, I would sit on my couch with my laptop balanced on my knees, scrolling through listings. I learned neighborhoods the way other people learned hobbies. I noticed patterns, prices, what stayed on the market, what disappeared quickly. I bookmarked places I could not afford yet, and others that felt possible if I kept saving. I taught myself the language of mortgages the same way I had taught myself everything else. Quietly and alone. I made appointments at banks during lunch breaks. I sat across from loan officers who explained interest rates and down payments in calm, practiced voices. I nodded, asked questions, and took notes. I never mentioned my family. I never framed it as a dream. I treated it like a plan, because plans felt safer than hopes. There were moments when doubt crept in. Nights when I wondered if I was being reckless, if I should wait, if I should keep things flexible in case my parents needed me. That thought would surface automatically, like an old reflex. Then I would remember every time waiting had only meant being passed over. When I finally found the townhouse, it did not look impressive. Not in the way people imagined when they talked about buying property. Brick exterior, narrow stairs, 2 bedrooms that felt modest instead of grand, a small fenced patio instead of a yard. But the moment I walked inside, something in my chest loosened. The light in the living room came in soft and steady through the windows. The neighborhood was quiet, not empty, just calm. Close enough to work to be practical, far enough from everything else to feel like a boundary. I walked through it slowly, room by room, imagining furniture, imagining mornings, imagining myself unlocking the door at the end of the day and knowing that whatever waited on the other side belonged to me. No explanations, no negotiations, no justifications. The day I signed the paperwork, my hands shook just a little. Not from fear, but from the weight of it. Years of saving, years of restraint, years of telling myself no had led to that moment. When the keys were placed in my palm, cool and solid, I felt something open inside me. Relief. Pride, a kind of calm I had never known before. I sat in my car afterward and just held them, letting the reality sink in. I had done this on my own, entirely on my own. I waited a few days before telling my parents, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted the moment to be mine first. I wanted to enjoy it without immediately bracing for someone else's reaction. When I did tell them, It was over for dinner. Casual, matter of fact. I said I had bought a place and that I would be moving in soon. Dad did not smile. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossing over his chest, eyes narrowing slightly. He asked how I had managed it. I explained simply, saving, planning, a steady job. I waited for questions about the neighborhood, the layout, whether I liked it. Instead, he went quiet for a moment, then said I had moved too quickly. He said there was a plan. He said timing mattered. He said decisions like that affected the whole family. The words landed strangely, like they belonged to a different conversation than the one I thought we were having. I reminded him gently that it was my money and my decision. He shook his head. He said that was not the point. According to Dad, the family was still in a holding pattern. Claire was still figuring things out. Her opportunities were not gone, just delayed. He said resources needed to stay flexible. He said my buying a house sent the wrong message. It suggested that I was prioritizing myself when the family needed to stay focused. I asked him to explain what that meant. He said I had gone ahead of schedule. He said I should have waited. He said moves like that made it harder for Claire to catch up. Mom sat quietly beside him, hands folded in her lap, eyes flicking between us but never settling anywhere. For a moment, I thought he was worried about me, about the responsibility, about the risk. But as he kept talking, that illusion fell apart. His concern was not whether I could handle home ownership. It was what my independence represented. A shift, a disruption, a loss of control. He said the money I was putting into my house could have been useful elsewhere. He said there were still camps and programs Claire could try. He said unexpected expenses came up. He said families had to think long-term. That was when I understood he was not talking about my future at all. He was talking about hers. My house was not a milestone to him. It was a misallocation. Proof that I was no longer playing my assigned role. Something hardened in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Clarity. For the first time, I saw the structure of our family without the emotional haze. It was not built on fairness or care. It was built on strategy, on return, on who was expected to deliver something of value. I told Dad I was proud of what I had done. I told him I had worked for it and that I deserved it. He shook his head again, frustration flashing across his face. He said I was being short-sighted. He said I did not understand the bigger picture. That was the moment everything shifted. I understood the bigger picture perfectly. It just did not include me. The conversation ended awkwardly. No congratulations. No questions about move-in dates. No curiosity. When I left that night, the air felt heavier, but I was not surprised. The reaction fit too neatly into a pattern that had been shaping my life for years. Moving into my townhouse was one of the happiest and loneliest experiences of my life. I unpacked boxes slowly, placing each item with care. I painted the walls myself, choosing colors that felt calm and grounded. I sat on the floor eating takeout because I did not own a dining table yet, and laughed out loud at the simplicity of it. This space did not judge me. It did not measure my worth. It did not ask me to wait. David did not come to see it. Neither did Mom. Claire texted to ask how it looked. I sent her a picture of the living room with afternoon light spilling across the floor. She replied with a heart. That was all. As weeks passed, Dad made small comments that revealed more than he probably intended. He mentioned costs. He mentioned how difficult things were for Claire. He mentioned sacrifices. Each remark carried the same message beneath the surface. My stability was inconvenient. My success was premature. I began questioning things I had never questioned before. Had there ever really been room for me in their vision of the future? Had my role always been to wait quietly while someone else chased a dream on my behalf? One evening, after another tense phone call, I sat on the steps of my patio and watched the sun dip below the neighboring rooftops. The air was cool. The street was quiet. Porch lights flickered on one by one. I thought about everything I had built, without permission and without applause. That was when the truth finally settled in. Dad was not angry because I bought a house. He was angry because I stepped outside the system he created. I made a move he could not control. And in doing so, I exposed something he did not want to face. I had never been behind. I had just been on a different path, one that did not serve his plan. As the light faded and evening wrapped around me, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve. I did not know what would come next, but I knew this. Whatever happened, I could not go back to pretending my life needed approval to move forward. And for the first time, that thought did not scare me. What I did not expect was how quickly fear would return in a different form. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet knock that changed the shape of everything. It happened 1 week after Christmas. I remember the day clearly because nothing about it stood out at first. A gray morning with low clouds pressing against the windows. My coffee sat untouched on the counter long enough to go cold. I was working from home, answering emails, half listening to the steady hum of the heater cycling on and off. It felt like an ordinary workday, the kind you forget as soon as it is over. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was a delivery. I was expecting a small bookshelf I had ordered. Something simple. Something safe. I remember thinking about where I would put it, whether it would fit against the living room wall or work better in the spare bedroom. The man at the door was polite and efficient. He asked my name. I confirmed it. He handed me a thick envelope and asked me to sign a small electronic pad. I did, distracted, already half turned back toward the house. He thanked me and walked away. I closed the door and stood there for a moment with the envelope in my hands, feeling an unease I could not quite place. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. I opened it at the kitchen counter. The paper inside was stiff and formal, the kind that does not bend easily. At first, the words did not register. Legal language has a way of draining emotion from meaning, of making everything sound distant and technical. I scanned lines about jurisdiction and claims and damages. My eyes moved without understanding. Then I saw Dad's name, then mine, then Claire's. The room seemed to tilt slightly, like my balance had shifted, even though I had not moved. I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself and read again, slower this time. Dad was suing me. Not threatening, no warning, not arguing, suing. The complaint stated that my decision to purchase my townhouse had caused financial harm to my sister, that by acting independently and out of sequence, I had interfered with her future opportunities, that I owed compensation for damages related to lost potential and family resources. I lowered myself into the chair at the table, my movements careful, deliberate. My hands were shaking now, not violently, but enough that I had to press them flat against the wood to steal them. I read the document again from the beginning, forcing myself to take in every word. Each sentence felt colder than the last. This was not written in anger. It was written deliberately, carefully, as if someone had taken the time to translate resentment into something official and irreversible. I felt sick. The betrayal did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors this time. It came printed on white paper, delivered by a stranger, backed by the authority of the legal system. Dad had not called. He had not warned me. He had not tried to talk things through. He had gone straight to a lawyer. I thought back to the Christmas dinner, to the way he had pointed at me across the table, to the words he had chosen. At the time, I had told myself it was emotional. A lapse, something that would cool with time. This proved otherwise. That outburst had not been the end of something. It had been the beginning. This was not a moment. It was a plan. I called Mom first. The phone rang longer than usual before she answered. When she finally did, her voice sounded tight, careful, like she was choosing each word before letting it leave her mouth. She said she knew this was coming. She said she did not know how to stop it. She said Dad felt he had no choice. No choice. She said he believed he was doing what was best for the family. She said he was trying to protect Claire. I asked her if she understood what this meant for me. The line went quiet. I could hear her breathing, slow and shallow. She said she hoped it would not go too far. I ended the call before I said something I could not take back. I did not call Dad. Not then. I needed space to understand what I was feeling before I tried to speak. Anger was there, sharp and immediate, but beneath it was something heavier, disappointment, grief, the slow realization that the line I thought existed between family conflict and something unforgivable had just been crossed. I read the complaint again, this time more carefully. The language framed me as reckless, selfish, disruptive. It described my independence as a problem that needed to be corrected. I was not described as a daughter. I was described as a variable that had thrown off an equation. That was when it truly hit me. Dad was not just angry. He was trying to reassert control. The house was not the issue. It was the fact that I had made a permanent decision without his approval and without regard for the hierarchy he believed in. The lawsuit was not about money. It was about punishment. I called a friend and asked her to come over. I needed another person in the room, another voice, to remind me that this was real, that I was not misreading the situation. She arrived within the hour, coat still on, concern written across her face. She read the papers slowly, her eyebrows lifting higher with each page. She asked if this was a joke. I shook my head. She asked if Dad was serious. I nodded. Hearing someone else say his name in disbelief made something crack open inside me. I felt exposed, ashamed, as if I had somehow failed by believing my family would never take things this far. The afternoon passed in a blur. I canceled meetings, let emails pile up unanswered. I sat on my couch staring at the wall, replaying every conversation from the past year, searching for a warning sign I might have ignored. There was none. David had simply decided that if I would not stay in my place willingly, he would force me back into it. By evening, shock began to harden into something else. Clarity. I started making calls. Not emotional ones, practical ones. I searched for attorneys. I asked questions. I took notes. I wrote down deadlines and steps. The calm that settled over me surprised me. I realized I had been preparing for this my entire life, just not in the way Dad expected. That night, I finally called him. He answered quickly, as if he had been waiting for it. I asked him why. He said this was not personal. He said this was about fairness. He said I had benefited from stability that Claire had not. He said families sometimes had to make hard decisions to correct imbalances. I told him I had never taken anything from him, that I had worked for everything I owned. He said that was beside the point. He said my success had consequences, whether I liked it or not. There was no apology, no hesitation, just certainty. When the call ended, I sat alone in the dark living room and let the weight of it settle. I felt something shift inside me again, quieter than fear, steadier than anger. Acceptance, not of what he had done, but of who he was willing to be. The next morning, I woke up early and made coffee. I spread the legal papers out on the table and read them one last time, not as a daughter hoping for understanding, but as a woman preparing to defend herself. The language no longer felt abstract. It felt pointed, intentional. The moment did not come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It came with a single, clear thought. In my dad's eyes, I was not a person who had built a life. It was a problem to be solved. And once you see yourself that way in someone else's story, you know you can never go back to pretending the relationship is something it is not. I folded the papers carefully and placed them in a folder. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not reach out to fix things. I simply understood that whatever came next would not be resolved with silence or compliance. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a legal fight, and now that preparation had a purpose. But purpose did not make the nights easier. Once the shock of the lawsuit settled into something more permanent, it began to seep into the quiet spaces of my life, the place in between moments when there was nothing to distract me from my own thoughts. I started waking up before my alarm, heart already racing, my chest tight as if I had been running in my sleep. My mind would latch onto phrases from the complaint and replay them on a loop. Loss of opportunity, family resources, equitable outcome. Words that sounded clean and neutral on paper, but carried a sharp, personal weight when I thought about what they really meant. They meant my dad had looked at my life and decided it needed to be corrected. I met with Patrick again later that week. His office felt familiar now, the same neutral art on the walls, the same quiet professionalism. This time his questions went deeper, not invasive, just precise in a way that left no room for interpretation. When did I start working? How many hours a week? What kind of income? How much financial support had I received from my parents? After I turned 16, Did I ever live at home rent-free as an adult? Had Dad ever co-signed a loan, paid a bill, covered tuition, helped with rent, groceries, car payments? Each answer came easily. No, no, no. Patrick nodded as he wrote, his pen moving steadily across the page. He did not react emotionally, which I appreciated. He said judges liked patterns, consistency, clear timelines. He said my situation was unusually well documented for someone my age. Then he paused and looked up at me. He said that did not mean it would be easy. Family cases, he explained, had a way of bleeding into everything else. They stirred emotions that facts alone could not fully contain. Even when the law was clear, the process could still feel brutal. He wanted me to be prepared for that. He was right. Once people around me knew what was happening, the atmosphere shifted in subtle ways. A coworker asked if everything was okay, and then immediately apologized for asking, as if she had crossed an invisible line. A neighbor offered to hold on to a package for me, so I would not have to answer the door if someone unexpectedly showed up again. Even small kindnesses felt heavy. Not unwelcome, but loaded, like reminders that something had gone wrong in a way that could not be neatly hidden. At home, my living room slowly began to resemble an archive. Stacks of documents labeled by year, envelopes sorted by job. I pulled records from boxes I had not opened in years, old tax returns, pay stubs from places I barely remembered working. A diner near campus, where I learned to balance trays and smile through exhaustion. A retail store I stayed at longer than I should have because the hours were reliable and the manager let me pick up extra shifts. Each piece of paper carried a memory. Late nights, sore feet, pride. The quiet satisfaction of knowing I was paying my own way. At the time, those moments had felt small and necessary. Looking at them now, laid out on my floor, I saw something different. I saw a timeline of endurance. I found an old notebook from college, its cover bent and edges frayed. Inside, the margins were filled with careful calculations. Rent, tuition payments, utilities, groceries. I had written everything down back then because I was afraid of slipping, afraid of making a mistake that would cost me stability, afraid of needing help I would not get. Maintained there on the floor, I realized I had been building something much bigger than a budget. I had been building proof. One afternoon, while scanning documents into my computer, my phone buzzed with a message from Dad. Not an apology, not an explanation, just a brief note asking if I had received the papers. The tone was neutral, almost professional, as if we were discussing a contract dispute instead of a lawsuit between a father and daughter. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. I did not respond. That silence felt heavier than I expected. It was uncomfortable. It went against every instinct I had developed over years of smoothing things over and making myself easier to deal with. But it also felt necessary. For once, I was not rushing to reassure him. I was letting the discomfort exist without trying to fix it. Claire called again a few days later. This time, her voice sounded different, less nervous, more worn down. She said Dad had been pacing around the house, walking about strategy and principles, about how this was all being blown out of proportion. She said Mom avoided the subject entirely, burying herself in chores and routines, as if order could be restored through repetition. Then Claire admitted something she had never said out loud before. She said she felt like she had failed him. She said that if she had just lived up to his expectations, none of this would be happening. I stopped her immediately. I told her that was not true, that this was not about her performance or my timing, that this was about Dad's need to control outcomes and people, and that no amount of success would have ever been enough to satisfy that. There was a long pause on the line. Then she said something that stayed with me long after we hung up. She said she did not know who she was without his plans. I understood that more than I wanted to admit. In different ways, we had both been shaped by the same force, just pushed in opposite directions. She had been over-invested in. I had been under-invested in. But neither of us had been allowed to simply exist without expectation. As the court date drew closer, Patrick began preparing me for what to expect. He explained the process in plain language. Who would speak first? What questions I might be asked? How to answer honestly without oversharing. He reminded me that this was not a therapy session. It was not a place to seek validation. It was a place to present facts. He told me to stay calm, to take my time, to remember that this was not a referendum on my worth as a daughter. That was easier said than done. At night, I practiced responses in my head, not speeches, just grounding statements. I supported myself. I made my own choices. I did not interfere with anyone else's opportunities. I repeated them until they felt solid, like something I could stand on when emotions tried to knock me off balance. There were moments when doubt crept in anyway. Quiet, insidious moments. When I wondered if I should have waited, if I should have softened the news about the house, if I should have been more careful with my independence, more discreet, less visible. Those thoughts slipped in when I was tired, when the paperwork felt endless, when the silence from my parents felt heavy. But then I would look around my home, at the furniture I had chosen, the walls I had painted myself, the calm that lived here, and I knew shrinking myself would not have saved this relationship. It would only have delayed the reckoning. One evening, while organizing yet another folder, I found a card Dad had given me years ago, a simple congratulations on a job promotion. No message inside beyond my name. I remembered how much that small acknowledgement had meant to me at the time, how little it had taken to make me feel seen. I held the card for a long moment, then placed it back in the box and closed it gently. That version of hope no longer belonged to me. The night before my next meeting with Patrick, I slept poorly. I dreamed I was standing in a courtroom without a voice, papers scattered at my feet, everyone waiting for me to speak. I woke up before dawn, heart pounding, and sat on the edge of my bed until the fear loosened its grip. When the sun finally rose, casting pale light across the room, I felt steadier. Not because I was confident about the outcome, but because I knew who I was. I had spent years proving it to myself in ways no one could erase. As I got dressed that morning, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, older than I felt, but there was something else there too. Resolve. The quiet kind that does not announce itself. This fight was never one I asked for, but it was one I was ready to see through. Because at the heart of it, this was not about money or timing or even fairness. It was about the right to live a life that did not require constant justification. And that was something I was no longer willing to surrender. Because at the heart of it, this was never just about a house or money or even timing. It was about being seen as a person instead of a position in someone else's plan. The morning of the hearing arrived quietly, almost cruelly ordinary. No thunder, no dramatic sunrise, no sign that this was the day my family would finally be forced to say the quiet parts out loud. The sky over Columbus was a flat winter gray, the kind that pressed down on you without asking permission. I sat in my car for a long moment before getting out, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my breath shallow and uneven. I remember noticing the radio was still on, some cheerful talk show host laughing about nothing important, and feeling almost offended that the world could sound so normal. I turned the engine off and sat there anyway, letting the silence settle. My stomach twisted the way it used to before exams or job interviews, but this was heavier. This was not about performance. This was about being judged for existing outside of a role I never agreed to play. Walking into the courthouse felt like stepping into a different temperature. Not just colder, but denser. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Shoes echoed sharply against polished floors, every step sounding louder than it needed to be. Conversations were hushed, clipped, purposeful. Everyone there seemed to be carrying something private and heavy, but no one looked at anyone else long enough to acknowledge it. Patrick met me near the metal detectors. He gave me a calm look and asked if I was ready. I nodded, even though ready was not the right word. What I felt was resolved. There was a difference. Ready implies confidence. Resolved means you are willing to walk forward even if it hurts. We passed through security and waited near the courtroom. I folded my hands together to keep them from shaking. Patrick reminded me quietly to breathe, to sit up straight, to answer only what was asked. His voice was steady, grounding. I clung to that steadiness. Dad arrived a few minutes later with Mom and Claire. They entered as a unit, the way they always had. Dad slightly ahead, shoulders squared. Mom close beside him, posture tense, lips pressed together. Claire just behind, her steps slower, hesitant. For a moment, I saw us the way strangers probably did. A family, neatly arranged. No raised voices, no visible cracks. That illusion had been our greatest skill. Dad did not look at me at first. His jaw was tight, his expression fixed in that familiar way he used when he believed he was in the right. He wore the same look he had worn at business meetings, parent-teacher conferences, any place he felt control mattered. It struck me then that this was exactly how he saw today, not as a reckoning, but as a negotiation. Claire glanced at me briefly. Her eyes were red, swollen like she had not slept. There was something fragile in her expression that I had never seen growing up. Not confidence, not resentment, just exhaustion. She gave me the smallest nod, barely perceptible, then looked down at the floor. Mom avoided my eyes completely. We took our seats. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand drama, no towering pillars, no theatrical sense of importance, just wood paneling, muted colors, and a quiet authority that felt unyielding. The American flag stood in the corner, heavy and still. I felt exposed sitting there, like every version of myself was present at once. The 16-year-old clocking in for her first shift. The college student is studying late into the night. The woman who had finally bought herself a home and been punished for it. Judge Judith Calder entered without flourish. No wasted motion, no performative seriousness. She carried herself with the kind of calm that comes from long familiarity with conflict. When she sat, the room fell silent, not because it was demanded, but because it felt appropriate. She reviewed the basics of the case in a steady, neutral voice. Names, claims, jurisdiction. It all sounded strangely detached from the reality I was living inside. Then she invited Dad to speak. He stood slowly. I watched him the way you watch someone you know too well, the clearing of his throat, the small adjustment of his jacket, the way he planted his feet, as if grounding himself. When he began to speak, his voice carried the practiced confidence of someone who believed he was, explaining something obvious. He talked about family values, about responsibility, about fairness, about the idea that siblings should move forward together, that no one should get too far ahead at the expense of the other. He said my decision to buy a house before Claire had disrupted the family plan, that it had created imbalance, that it sent the wrong message, not just to Claire, but to the entire family. As he spoke, I felt something unexpected rise up in me. Not anger, not even hurt. Clarity. He truly believed this. In his mind, my success was not neutral. It was an offense. Judge Calder listened without interruption. Her face gave nothing away. When Dad finished, she leaned forward slightly and asked him to clarify the legal basis of his claim. He hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Then he began talking about moral obligation, tradition, expectations, about how families functioned when everyone understood their role. She let him speak, then asked if there was any written agreement between us, any contract, any documentation that I had agreed to delay my life. David said no. She asked if I had used family money to purchase the house. He admitted I had not, but added quickly that my success was built on the stable environment my parents had provided. Judge Calder raised one eyebrow, almost imperceptibly. She asked how that stability had been distributed between his two daughters. Dad launched into an explanation of Claire's athletic career, the early promise, the attention from coaches, the belief that she would receive scholarships and go far. He spoke about camps, private trainers, travel teams, long weekends spent driving from one tournament to another. He framed it as supporting the child with the most potential. The word investment was never spoken, but it hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Judge Calder asked him directly if he believed children were investments. Dad bristled. He insisted he loved both his daughters, that love and strategy were not the same thing, that some children simply needed more resources. She nodded slowly, then asked why those resources were never offered to me. The silence that followed felt physical, like pressure building behind my eyes. That was when Helen Porter was called to the stand. Seeing her again felt surreal. She had been such a quiet presence in my teenage years, someone who noticed without making a spectacle of it. She walked with measured steps, her posture straight, her expression composed. When she spoke, her voice was calm, professional, but firm. She testified about my high school years, about my requests for guidance, about meetings my parents declined to attend, about notes in her files indicating that family resources were being focused elsewhere. She confirmed that I worked throughout school and received no financial support from my family. Dad shifted in his seat. Judge Calder asked Helen if she had observed favoritism. Helen paused, chose her words carefully, then said yes, that it had been evident even then, that she had documented it. Something inside my chest loosened. Not relief exactly, but release. The truth was no longer something I had to carry alone. Patrick presented my records next. Pay stubs, bank statements, tax filings, proof of independence stretching back years. Each document felt like another piece of my life laid bare under fluorescent lights. I watched Dad as they were presented. His face tightened. He looked confused, almost offended, as if my preparation itself was an act of betrayal. Dad was given another opportunity to speak. He talked about intentions, about believing Claire would succeed if given enough time, about frustration when things did not go according to plan, about feeling blindsided by my decision to move forward without waiting. Judge Calder listened, then asked a question that cut through everything. She asked whether he believed his role as a father included controlling them, adult lives of his children, in order to fulfill his own expectations. Dad opened his mouth, then closed it. That pause said more than any argument. Judge Calder nodded once and announced a brief recess before delivering her ruling. As everyone stood, my legs trembled beneath me. I remained seated for a moment, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from release. The truth had been spoken, out loud, in a room where it mattered. I did not look at Dad as we waited. I did not need to. No matter what happened next, the illusion that had shaped my family for decades had already cracked. And for the first time in my life, that crack did not feel like failure. It felt like freedom. The bailiff called us back into the courtroom, his voice neutral, almost bored, as if this were just another case on an endless list. Chairs scraped softly as people stood and sat again. I noticed how loud those small sounds felt now. Every cough, every shuffle of paper seemed amplified. My heart was beating hard enough that I wondered if anyone else could hear it. Judge Judith Calder returned and took her seat without ceremony. She adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, placed her glasses on her nose, and looked out over the room. Her gaze moved slowly, deliberately, from one side to the other. When her eyes passed over me, they did not linger, but there was no coldness there either. Just focus. The silence stretched longer than I expected, long enough for my thoughts to start spiraling again, long enough for old habits to whisper that maybe I had imagined the clarity of the earlier testimony, long enough for a part of me to brace for disappointment, because disappointment had always been the safer expectation. Then she began to speak. She summarized the case in plain language. No drama, no embellishment. She recounted Dad's claim that my purchase of a home had harmed my sisters. Future prospects. She referenced the argument about family order and moral obligation. Hearing those words spoken aloud in such a calm, professional tone made them sound even more fragile than they already were. Stripped of emotion, they revealed how little substance they had. She then reviewed the testimony. Helen Porter's statements, my employment records. The financial documentation shows years of self-support. As she spoke, I felt the tension in my shoulders slowly begin to ease, not because I was confident of the outcome, but because the truth had been laid out so clearly. Judge Calder picked up the complaint itself and read directly from it. The phrasing felt stiff and almost surreal in her voice. Phrases that had once made my stomach drop now sounded oddly distant, like something written by someone who did not understand the people involved at all. She paused mid-sentence, lowered the papers, and looked up. Her gaze landed on Dad. The room felt impossibly still. I could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear Claire shift in her seat beside Mom. Time seemed to slow, not in a dramatic way, but in a way that sharpened every sensation. Judge Calder spoke 2 words, dismissed entirely. There was no raised voice, no gavel slam, just those 2 words, spoken clearly and without hesitation. They landed with a finality that took a moment to fully register. For a split second, my mind went blank, as if my brain had been preparing for impact for so long that when the moment arrived, it needed time to catch up. Then the meaning settled in, spreading through my chest like warmth. She continued speaking, explaining her ruling in detail. She stated plainly that there was no law requiring an adult child to delay personal milestones until a sibling achieved similar success. She said the court did not recognize the concept of children as financial investment, nor did it recognize lost hypothetical opportunity as a basis for damages. She emphasized that moral beliefs, cultural expectations, and personal disappointment were not enforceable under the law, that the legal system was not a venue for resolving perceived failures of family hierarchy. Each sentence felt like another layer being peeled away from the story Dad had told himself for years. Judge Calder then addressed Dad directly. Her tone did not change, but something in her posture sharpened. She said that filing a lawsuit to punish an adult child for lawful, independent decisions was an abuse of the legal process. She warned that courts existed to resolve actual legal disputes, not to enforce control or extract obedience. She did not raise her voice. She did not shame him, but her words carried weight. She concluded by affirming that my purchase of a home using my own funds was entirely lawful and required no explanation or justification to anyone, including family members. With a light tap of her gavel, the ruling was final. For a moment, no one moved. I felt Patrick's hand rest gently on my arm. He leaned in slightly and whispered congratulations. I nodded, but the word felt almost foreign. Bonjour implies celebration. What I felt was something quieter and deeper. Dad remained seated for a few seconds longer than everyone else. When he finally stood, it was as if the air had gone out of him. His shoulders sagged just slightly, a change so subtle most people would not have noticed it. I did. He did not look at me. His eyes stayed fixed somewhere ahead, unfocused, as if he were replaying the last several minutes in his head, trying to find the moment where everything went wrong. Claire stood slowly. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. When she glanced at me, there was relief there, yes, but also fear. Fear of what came next, now that the plan Dad had built his life around had collapsed in a single sentence. Mom gathered her purse with shaking hands. She still did not look at me, not even as they turned to leave. As they passed by, I caught a glimpse of Dad's face in profile. His jaw was tight, his mouth pressed into a thin line. There was no anger, no outrage, just emptiness, the look of someone who had lost something fundamental and did not yet know how to replace it. He walked past me without a word. I watched them leave the courtroom, their backs retreating down the aisle, and felt a strange ache settle in my chest. No regret, no doubt. Grief. Grief for the version of my family that had never truly existed, but that I had spent years hoping for anyway. When the room began to empty, I stayed seated. The wooden bench beneath me felt solid and grounding. I placed my hands on it, needing to feel something real. Around me, people gathered their belongings and moved on with their days. For them, this was just another case concluded. For me, it was the end of a chapter that had defined my entire life. I did not feel triumphant. There was no urge to smile or cry or call anyone. I felt calm. Deeply, unexpectedly calm, as if something that had been pressing on me for decades had finally lifted. Patrick asked if I was ready to go. I nodded and stood, my legs steady beneath me. As I walked toward the exit, I took one last look at the judge's bench. Not out of gratitude exactly, but recognition. The system had worked. not because it favored me, but because it refused to validate something fundamentally wrong. Outside, the cold air hit my face, sharp and clean. I took a deep breath, the kind I had not realized I had been holding for years. The sky was still gray, the city still moving, the world unchanged. But I was different. The lawsuit was over, the investment was over. The role I had been assigned without my consent was finally gone. As I stood on the courthouse steps, my coat pulled tight around me, I understood something with complete clarity. Winner did not mean taking anything from my family. And in that quiet, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. The silence after the verdict did not feel empty. It felt intentional, like the pause after a deep breath you did not realize you had been holding for years. When I walked back into my house that night, it seemed to absorb me. The familiar creak of the floorboards near the entry, the soft hum of the refrigerator cycling on and off, the porch light casting a gentle, almost protective glow across the doorway. Nothing about the space had changed, yet everything inside me had. I hung my coat on the same hook by the door and stood there longer than necessary. In the past, coming home after something difficult always came with a sense of waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for the reaction, waiting for judgment, disappointment, or instructions on how I was supposed to feel next. That waiting had been a constant background noise in my life for as long as I could remember. This time, there was no waiting, just stillness. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, letting the coolness of the glass ground me. My hands were steady. That alone felt like a quiet victory. For weeks, my body had lived in a constant state of alert, bracing for confrontation, rehearsing explanations, preparing to defend choices that never should have required defense in the way. First place. Now, my shoulders are relaxed. My breath moved easily in and out. I checked my phone again, not out of urgency, but curiosity. A few missed calls from unknown numbers, probably extended family who had already heard a distorted version of the story. I imagined the whispers, the opinions formed without context, the assumptions about loyalty and obedience. I felt no pull to correct any of it. I set the phone down. Later that evening, Claire's message came through. She wrote slowly, carefully, as if every word carried weight. She said she had been replaying the hearing in her head, hearing Dad talk about plans and investments and order. She said she realized something that frightened her more than the outcome of the case, that she had never been allowed to fail. Not publicly, not privately, not even in her own thoughts. She wrote that every stumble had been treated like a threat to the future Dad had mapped out for her long before she understood what it meant. She said when she did not get the scholarship, she felt like she had broken something inside him, that his disappointment turned into pressure, and that pressure slowly became her entire identity. She said she no longer knew where her own desires ended and his expectations began. As I read her words, I felt a complicated mix of empathy and exhaustion. I understood her pain deeply. I recognized it. I had lived a parallel version of it, shaped differently, but rooted in the same soil. At the same time, I felt the weight of my own limits. I responded honestly. I told her that I saw how heavy that must have been, that no one should grow up feeling like their worth depended on a return someone else expected. I told her that it made sense she felt lost now that the plan had collapsed. And I told her, gently but firmly, that the collapse might be the beginning of something truer. Then I drew a line. I told her I was not going to apologize for buying my home. I was not going to debate whether I should have waited. I was not going to accept responsibility for decisions that were never mine to manage. I told her I loved her as my sister, but I was done being the one who made herself smaller so everyone else could. Stay comfortable. When I hit send, my body did not tense the way it used to. There was no surge of fear, no anticipation of backlash. Just certainty, calm and grounded. A few minutes later, my phone lit up again. Dad. I watched his name glow on the screen. For a moment, muscle memory kicked in. The instinct to answer immediately, to listen, to explain, to soften the moment before it could turn sharp. That instinct had been shaped over decades, reinforced every time I was praised for being understanding, for being easy, for not complicating things. I let the phone ring. As the seconds passed, something remarkable happened. The anxiety I expected did not arrive. My chest did not tighten. My stomach did not drop. Instead, I felt a steady sense of rightness. Not defiance, not anger. Alignment. When the call went to voicemail, I placed the phone face down on the table and walked into the living room. Mom sent a message later that night. She said she hoped we could talk soon. The words were polite, careful, restrained. There was no acknowledgement of what had happened. No apology. Just an invitation that felt heavy with expectation. The kind of invitation that assumed I would show up and do the emotional work. I did not respond. I went to bed early, not because I was exhausted, but because I wanted to be alone with my thoughts in a space that finally felt safe. As I lay there, the house settling around me, I realized something quietly profound. Silence was no longer something I feared. It was something I had chosen. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as I made coffee. The ordinary ritual felt grounding. I stood there in my robe, watching steam rise from the mug, and thought about how many mornings I had started with tension already humming beneath my skin, bracing for conflict that had not yet arrived. Today there was none. I went to work. I answered emails. I sat in meetings and offered my opinions without second-guessing myself. No one there knew what I had just lived through, and that anonymity felt freeing. I was not a daughter in conflict, not a defendant, not a problem to be solved. I was simply myself, competent and capable, moving through my day. That afternoon, when I returned home, I noticed how different the house felt. Not physically, but emotionally. I watered plants that had survived weeks of neglect while my attention was elsewhere. I organized a drawer that had been bothering me for months. I folded laundry slowly, deliberately, taking care instead of rushing through it. Small acts of maintenance that felt symbolic in ways I did not need to name. Another message came from Claire a few days later. Shorter this time, less apologetic, more reflective. She said she had been thinking about what success meant if it was not measured by Dad's expectations. She admitted that the thought scared her, but she also said it felt strangely hopeful. I replied that fear was often the first sign of freedom. That building a life of her own would not be easy, but it would be hers. Dad did not call again that week, and something in me shifted because of it. The absence of his voice no longer felt like punishment. It felt like peace. One evening, I sat on the couch with a blanket pulled over my legs, the lamp casting a soft circle of light around me. Outside, the street was quiet. A car passed occasionally. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds of ordinary lives continuing. I realized this was the first time since buying the house that I was not waiting for someone to challenge my right to be there. I was not rehearsing defenses. I was not bracing for criticism. I was simply existing in a space I had earned. I stood and walked through the house slowly, touching the walls, the door frames, the counters I had chosen myself. Every detail carried a memory of effort, long hours, careful planning, quiet determination. No one else's approval was embedded in these walls, just mine. Later, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, yes, but settled. There was a steadiness in my eyes that had not been there before. I smiled, not because everything was resolved, but because I finally trusted myself. Lying in bed, I listened to the house breathe around me, the soft creak of wood, the distant sound of wind, familiar, comforting noises. I thought about how long I had believed peace came after resolution, after agreement, after forgiveness. Now I understand something different. Peace came from boundaries, from choosing not to engage in battles that required me to abandon myself, from accepting that not everyone would understand my choices, and deciding that understanding was no longer my responsibility. As sleep pulled me under, I felt something I had rarely allowed myself to feel. Safety. Not because the world had become kinder, but because I had finally stopped giving power to what hurt me. And in that quiet, I knew the hardest part was over. The hardest part was realizing that nothing else needed to happen for this chapter of my life to be complete. There was no final confrontation after the court case, no dramatic apology, No moment where Dad suddenly understood everything he had done wrong and reached out with tears in his eyes. Life did not wrap itself up with a bow. It simply went on. And for the first time, I went on with it without waiting for permission. I woke up in my house the morning after the verdict and stood at the kitchen, the window longer than usual, holding my coffee with both hands. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. Quiet street, a few cars pulled out of driveways, someone walking a dog. Ordinary life continues. And yet, inside me, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer bracing for impact. I was no longer rehearsing explanations. I was just there. For most of my life, I believed closure came from agreement, from someone finally saying, "You were right," from hearing the words I had needed to hear since childhood. I thought closure meant reconciliation, or at least acknowledgement. But standing alone in that kitchen, I understood something different. Closure came from choosing not to keep reopening a wound just because someone else insisted it was still bleeding. My mind drifted back to Christmas dinner. The table was crowded with familiar faces. The smell of food, the sound of silverware, the moment Dad pointed at me and accused me of stealing my sister's future. For weeks, those words had replayed in my head, sharp and relentless. I had taken them apart piece by piece, trying to see if there was any truth in them. There was not. I did not steal anyone's future. I refused to sacrifice my own. That distinction mattered more than the verdict itself, more than the judge's ruling, more than any document stamped and filed away. It was the truth that finally settled into my bones. Claire and I stayed in light contact after the trial. Not the kind of conversations people imagine when they talk about healing. No long, emotional confessions. No promises to fix the past. Just honest, careful exchanges. She told me she was starting to realize how much of her life had been shaped by expectations she never chose. She admitted she was scared of disappointing Dad if she stopped chasing them. Version of success he believed in. I listened. I did not rush to reassure her. I did not step in to carry that weight for her. For the first time, I let her sit with her own feelings without trying to manage them. And for the first time, she did not ask me to. Dad stayed silent. That silence used to feel like punishment, like the withdrawal of love, like proof that I had failed some unspoken test. Now, it felt like distance. And distance, I learned, was not always a loss. Sometimes, it was protection. Mom sent a few short messages. Neutral, polite, carefully worded. Invitations to talk, without any acknowledgement of what had happened. I responded, when I felt able, briefly, calmly, without explanation. Boundaries did not need justification. They needed consistency. One afternoon, I stood in my backyard, hands tucked into my coat pockets, watching the bare branches sway in the wind. This was where I had been accused of betrayal, for daring to build something of my own. Standing there now, it felt different. Not reclaimed exactly, redefined. This space no longer held tension or expectation. It held quiet. I thought about the language Dad had always used. Investment, return, order. For years, I tried to be efficient, low maintenance, self-sufficient to the point of invisibility. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. I had believed that needing nothing was the same as being strong. What I learned instead was this. Being capable did not mean being expendable. Being responsible did not mean being required to carry everyone else. Being independent did not mean I owed my independence to anyone but myself. There was grief in that realization. Real grief. Not the kind that comes with loss of a person, but the loss of an idea. The idea that my family might one day see me without conditions. That Dad might value me without measuring me against a plan. That Mom might speak up instead of smoothing things over. Letting go of those hopes hurt more than the lawsuit ever did. But grief was not the same as regret. I did not regret buying my house. I did not regret standing my ground. I did not regret refusing to apologize for living my life on my terms. If anything, I regretted how long it had taken me to realize I was allowed to do that. One evening, I invited a few friends over for dinner. Nothing special. Simple food. Easy conversation. At one point, someone commented on how peaceful my home felt. I smiled at that. They had no idea how hard that peace had been won. not through confrontation, not through revenge, but through refusal. Refusal to wait my turn in a system that never planned to reward me. Refusal to shrink so someone else could feel larger. Refusal to accept guilt for choosing a life that fits me. I realized then that the order Dad believed in was never really about fairness or family harmony. It was about control, about managing outcomes, about protecting an investment at all costs. And the moment I stepped outside that framework, the entire structure collapsed. That collapse was not my responsibility. The only order that mattered now was the one I chose. The order of my mornings, the order of my priorities, the order in which I placed my own well-being above expectations that harmed me. I used to think revenge had to be loud, dramatic, public. I imagined revenge as a moment where someone finally felt what they had made me feel. But this was quieter than that, deeper. Living well without asking permission, telling the truth without needing to punish anyone else, choosing peace even when others wanted conflict. Late one night, I stood in my doorway, with the lights turned low, the house settling around me, pipes clicking, Indy brushing against the windows, familiar sounds that anchored me in the present. I felt whole, in a way I never had before, not because everything was resolved, but because I had stopped fighting myself. This was not the end of my story. There were still relationships to navigate, conversations that might happen someday, or might not. But for the first time, I trusted myself to handle whatever came next without betraying who I was. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this: silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. I am still writing the rest of my story, but for now, this chapter is exactly where it belongs.